let's go ahead and move on to Chapter 5. So Chapter 5 is about the pandemic of modern slavery, human trafficking. So the reason I wanted to look at this chapter is because it is an important topic that is happening around the world, but also here within the state of Indiana and also, in the United States. And so human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the use of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Now, that's a pretty long definition, but it really does give the details of what human trafficking is and what it involves. And so your text talks about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed in the United States in the year 2000, which adopted the UN definition and extended special protection to foreigners who were trafficked into the United States. So oftentimes individuals are trafficked from one country to another. And so it's important to understand that the definition includes a variety of activities for which people can be prosecuted for. And so this can happen from people coming from India or Thailand into the United States and vice versa. And so this Trafficking Victims Protection Act exists because of this large definition and how there's a lot of different ways that people could be charged in regards to human trafficking. So you can see on the picture that National Human Trafficking Awareness Day is January 11th. So let's look at some of the differences in human trafficking. So there are forced labor, sex trafficking, organ trafficking, baby trafficking, debt bondage, child brides, and child soldiers. So unfortunately, a lot of people just think that human trafficking is sex trafficking, and that is not the case. So we're going to go through each one of these because I think it's important for us to be aware of the different types of trafficking and ways possibly that you could recognize if there's a trafficking situation going on in your neighborhood or around you or in your workplace. So the first one is forced labor. So this is really prevalent in many parts of the world. Workers are often brought from other countries to work, and then they end up being treated as slaves. So sometimes workers owe an increasing amount of debt. So it can depend on whether they're needing to pay off the debt or if they've been tricked into thinking it's a job. So there's a story of one woman who thought she was going to be a painter. She was going to get money. She was a single mom, and she was going to this other country to do some painting work, and they ended up basically making her do other things, so in regards to forced labor. So she thought she was going to do one job, and they ended up making her do another job. So some examples are fishing in Thailand, brick making in India and Afghanistan, and also chocolate production in Western Africa, Asia, and South America. So instead of, hiring individuals to do these different jobs or working with them to pay off their debt, they just force them to do this type of labor without really any pay other than their life, essentially. The next one is sex trafficking. So victims are forced into sex trafficking. Most victims are men, women, and children. So it's important to note that I put men in there because oftentimes it's overlooked that it's just women and children, but men are also being sex trafficked. In some countries, parents will sell their children to obtain money for the family. So they will literally get involved with a trafficking ring, either to then pay off debt or to get some type of money in exchange for their child. And that's how they go about the business. In the United States, the commercial sexual exploitation of children is referred to as domestic minor sex trafficking. So if you ever see an article that talks about DMST, that's domestic minor sex trafficking. An interesting one that a lot of people don't know about is organ trafficking. So organ trafficking can be voluntary or involuntary. Sometimes poor individuals are more likely to be conned into this type of organ trafficking idea. There's usually long waiting lists for organs, which cause an increased demand. And sometimes infants, young children, and some adults are most vulnerable. So part of that involuntary organ donation is the kidnapping of an individual's for the removal of organs. So no attention is given to sanitation. The surgeons are poorly trained, if they're even surgeons, and sometimes victims tend not to survive. So sometimes people will be kidnapped just for that, or so I had my gallbladder removed a couple years ago. If you've ever thought about it, we're basically putting the trust in the hands of these individuals to take out the proper organ and, not do anything else while they're in there. And so I bring that up because I find it fascinating that, okay, going in to take out my gallbladder, what if they took out my pancreas and I don't know it? Okay, so that could be involuntary. Infants. Sometimes when infants are born in some of these countries, they will take the infant and say, oh, we've got to do some tests or we've got to do something else on them. And they'll literally take out organs from the baby. And they'll con basically the poor individuals to say, oh, your baby had this type of health condition. And so it's really unfortunate that this happens in different countries where organs are taken from people, people are kidnapped specifically for organs to be taken from them for money. Next, we have baby trafficking and debt bondage. So baby trafficking, most of us have heard of the black market. There's black market adoptions. Sometimes this is where infants' organs are sold or the babies themselves are sold. And it's really used as leverage against the mothers. So it possibly could be a father that kidnaps the child and then sells them on the black market, or the mother themselves, again, similar to selling off your child, may need to pay off a debt, and so they will have that leverage against the mother in order for them to pay off their debt. Similar to that is debt bondage, where it's the continuous enslavement of victims. So the debt continues to increase, and they're forced to work off their debt against their will. So the debt could be any type of debt. It usually has to do with, arranging for their jobs, transportation, living accommodations, daily expenses. And so it's common for traffickers to tell victims that, oh, your job for travel costs too much, so now your debt has increased. You got to pay it off. And then, it just keeps building and building and building. So they're never able to get out of debt, basically. They just continue being enslaved by them. Next is child brides. So similar to instead of just selling off the children, this is when they enter into involuntary marriages, mostly through specific cultural traditions. So once they're married, then they're treated as sex slaves, housekeepers, and mothers for the heirs for their husbands. So this isn't, I don't want you to get this confused with arranged marriages. So at least oftentimes arranged marriages, there's an agreement between the two families in regards to the two people getting married, where these aren't generally voluntary. Being a part of an arranged marriage is still being voluntary within your specific culture, but you're also treated differently once you are married. You're not then going to be used as a sex slave or only a housekeeper and you have nothing else that you're able to do. And so that is a difference between the child brides and arranged marriages. And then also with child brides, the age can vary. So they may not even be old enough to rear children yet, and so they'll then have to wait until they can actually have children, but the family will still marry them off as a child bride. So their lives are usually characterized by hard work and, as I mentioned, child rearing, and usually they are uneducated and oftentimes prohibited from activities that they may choose. So unlike in a arranged marriage where, the bride and groom will do things together and they have, more freedom, these people are really enslaved within the marriage. So they're not able to do certain activities. They may never leave their home. And so oftentimes then they are uneducated as well. And then we have child soldiers. So child soldiers are any child under the age of 18 who is forced to participate in armed conflict, even as cooks or messengers. So this is not like individuals in the United States who join the Army, who voluntarily decide to enlist. These children are often put into guerrilla armies and are being kidnapped from their villages. They're oftentimes forced by leaders upon the threat of their own deaths if they don't join. So this is quite a bit different than what we are used to hearing. So we want to look at those who human traffic. So not the ones being trafficked, but the ones who do the actual trafficking. So oftentimes stereotypes of people who are involved in human trafficking are young males in outlandish attire. They have expensive vehicles, like they're rolling up in the Denali, Suburban or limo. Usually stereotyped as African Americans found in inner city neighborhoods. But you can see on the right-hand side, the real human trafficker could be a male or a female. They could be seen at any age, and they are excellent profilers and con artists. So they're able to coerce individuals into kidnapping them, having them come with them. So that's part of their job. Women traffickers is actually a growing trend. They're seen as less threatening to potential victims, and they don't fit the trafficker stereotype. So they're able to get more victims to join them and to be a part of the trafficking ring. Sometimes those women traffickers have basically moved up in a way from being a victim to then working as a part of the ring. Potential victims of human trafficking include women and children of both sexes, young girls seeking to find a better life. So unfortunately, if they're in a country where they're unhappy, maybe uneducated, they just don't feel like that they are making a way within their life, they'll get sucked into a human trafficking ring by being promised of a better life. So sometimes those human traffickers will coerce young girls into saying, oh, come with me and I can pay for your education. I can give you a better life in this other country. So oftentimes these individuals could be runaways. They can be men in poorer countries who are looking to make an income. And then oftentimes vulnerable populations are trafficked, such as deaf children and transgendered children, who sometimes could be runaways as well. So looking at the health of sex trafficking survivors. So victims are prone to sexually transmitted diseases. Unfortunately, oftentimes, especially the sex traffickers are not provided condoms, they're not provided adequate health care, they're not provided adequate testing or vaccinations. Sometimes they're deprived of food, water, and sleep. They're often beaten by the pimps or customers, so oftentimes they may be beaten as soon as they are brought into the trafficking ring. One of the pimps will, beat them, sexually abuse them, and what that does is it basically breaks them. So it breaks the individual from who they were, and they kind of strip them of their identity and self-worth, and then they send them out to customers. So basically they don't think of themselves, they just do their job. Because of that, then they're likely to suffer from mental illnesses and drug abuse, because once they've been broken by that pimp or customers, then, how do they deal with the situation that they're in? They didn't expect to be in this place. What do they do? And so they start to suffer from different mental illness. They may use drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. So they receive medical care only when absolutely necessary. And sometimes that's not usually sanitized healthcare or by a professional who is trained. Also, if a sex trafficking victim gets pregnant, they're required to get an abortion, and Lord knows if that is sanitized or if that's done by a professional as well. There's an organization called the Polaris Project who provides red flags to raise awareness for sex trafficking. So that includes if you are around an individual who's disoriented, they have a lack of financial control, they don't have proper identification. So a lot of individuals who are trafficked in one way or another, whether it be sex trafficked or into forced labor, are stripped of their IDs. So they don't have a visa, a passport, a driver's license. So it's very difficult to identify them. They also have a lack of personal freedom, such as always having someone with him or her. Sometimes that's a pimp, sometimes that's one of the pimp's workers, who kind of follows the girls around, makes the discussions in regards to who they can go with and who they can't go with. So the Polaris Project, if you go to polarisproject.org, has a lot of information in order to, find out and recognize if you think someone is a part of a trafficking situation. These give you some more red flags in looking into their situation. So oftentimes treatment constraints, I mentioned some of these before. Trafficking victims don't have control over their own bodies, time, and money. They can't complete antibiotic courses or abstain from sex to prevent the spread of STDs. Like I said, cannot use condoms unless it's okay with the pimp or customer, often not allowed to prevent pregnancies, and pregnancies sometimes are used to control the victim. So some interventions that have been created, Georgia was the first state to develop a statewide response to that domestic minor sex trafficking using a team effort approach. So the first priority was to establish safety through safe houses and shelters. So similar to homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, these different shelters are existing, or they're even putting them within domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters in order for victims to try and escape and get to a safe house and a shelter and to move on from there. Survivors then evaluated for other needs, so they're able to determine if they need new identification, if they need health care. So Trafficking in Persons lists phone numbers and resources for survivors that are there. So the basic medical care cost to treat one human trafficking survivor is $30,000. So if anybody is really, worried about the cost and what this is costing human trafficking survivors, or what it's costing, the United States and the world by allowing this to happen, once we are able to get someone out of that situation and help them become a survivor instead of a victim, it's $30,000 in medical care to treat them, whether it be mental illnesses, potentially sexual transmitted diseases, or if they were pregnant when they escaped and got to the safe house. So I find that that's an interesting statistic that really kind of makes it sink in for a lot of people in looking at global health financially. So I will have a documentary posted for you that you guys either should have watched before you listen to the lecture or afterwards, and it has to do with human trafficking, and I feel like it gives a great behind-the-scenes look at more specifically sex trafficking and how a group was trying to prevent that from happening. So I hope everybody has a great week.